This is how I set up my A7 III to be able to switch quickly between photo and video modes and have access to all the settings that I regularly use without having to go into the Sony menu system. Hey, my name's Jake, and normally I do stuff like this. I create content for solo creators by doing reviews of equipment that makes the process easier and tips and tutorials on how to use that equipment. Now, before we jump into how I've set this camera up so that I can get around and get access to all the settings that I use regularly on shoots without having to go into the Sony menu system, because let's face it, the Sony menu system, at least on these cameras, was not the best, most intuitive menu system in the world. You can, thankfully, because there are custom buttons and lots of custom ways to set this up, set everything to where you pretty much don't even need to go into the Sony menu system except when you format a card. This may not be the perfect setup for you. It may give you a good starting place, and then from there you can go and customize your own camera the way that you want to set it up in the way that works best for you. One thing that is important to realize when you're out shooting by yourself and you need to be able to move quickly between different modes is, once you've set something up, then do it that way every single time. Don't be constantly changing your settings, changing the way you have things set up. Once you find a system that works for you, stick with it, because the more you use it that way, the less you have to think about it or remember where did I put that setting, and the more intuitive and the more just second nature it becomes. So a lot like developing muscle memory, you want to be able to develop the memory to where you just know exactly where certain things are on your camera. However you set your camera up, whatever works for you, do it that way every single time, and you'll find that your ability to move around with your camera and capture the things you want to capture gets faster and faster, because you're thinking less about the settings in particular and thinking more about the type of shot you want to capture. Having said that, let's jump into how I've got this camera set up to basically be the fastest amount of access you need for switching between photo and different video modes as a run and gun shooter, or somebody who's constantly on the go and trying to film and take photos basically all at the same time and as quickly as possible. Now, because this is such a long video, I put timestamps down below so you can skip around and see the sections you want to see. And if you want to sit and watch the entire video, I appreciate that, because it probably helps me somehow with the YouTube algorithm. But let's jump into this right now. For photo mode, I always shoot in RAW, uncompressed, because I want the most amount of detail, the most amount of information to be able to work with in post. If I ever do shoot in JPEG, then it's in large, extra fine. I always use 3x2 mode, unless I'm going to shoot photos with like the Sony anamorphic, then I'll put it in 16:9 because it's just a little easier for me to calculate how to de-squeeze it in post. For APS-C Super 35 mode, this is where if you have a lens that's an APS-C lens, you're going to put on a full frame camera, then it'll automatically switch into APS-C mode, unless that lens is a full manual lens like the Sony anamorphic lenses. Then you have to do that yourself, and I've got that mapped to a custom button that I'll show you in just a few. Long exposure noise reduction, I always have this turned off because of two reasons. One, you can always get better quality noise reduction when you're using a computer and processing it in post, and you get a lot more detailed control over that. But also, when you're out shooting in the cold doing astrophotography or something like that, like I do up here in the wintertime, it takes forever for the camera to process the image and give you a preview. And so when you're setting up shots and kind of testing out your settings, making sure you're getting that dialed in, I don't want to wait like 30 seconds to a minute between every shot to see how it's going to look. So if you have this turned off, then you get a much quicker instant preview of the shot you just took, and then you can make adjustments and go from there. Plus, it's just much better to process your noise reduction in post anyway. For color space, I use sRGB. For lens compensation, this is where the camera automatically accounts for chromatic aberration, shading, distortion. I have that all set on auto. It doesn't really affect the raw files, but in video mode, it definitely does affect how the files come out, because it will correct for especially the distortion, and I prefer to work that way rather than trying to correct it in post. For drive mode, I use continuous shooting. I don't really do a lot of bracketing, but you can do stuff here. I don't mess with bracketing much. Now here's where I set things up to be able to use a lot of different modes just by flipping the dial. One, if you're in M, which is manual photo mode, which is the way I use it, but if you have auto white balance, auto ISO, you can set up for shutter priority and stuff like that. So it's sort of all manual or somewhat manual or kind of fully automatic, depending on how you want to set it up. But for video mode, I switch between these modes pretty quickly. So number one, I have my 1080 120 for when I want to shoot slow motion, and you can set up so that the frame rate, the f-stop is all set, the auto ISO is how I set mine, and auto white balance, and then I'll change those as I go. But I want it to kind of default so that if I can switch into it quickly and start shooting right away, I can at least capture the shot without having to mess with a lot of settings. For number two, I do 4K 24 and with the proper frame rate and f-stop, etc. And again, auto ISO and auto white balance, just so that I can flip into it and start shooting right away and not miss a shot if I don't need to. When you go into video mode, I don't have this set this way right now because I want to show you the screen, but normally I have this set to 4K 30, and I use that occasionally when I want to slow it down just slightly in post to give it somewhat of a dreamlike feel, just a little bit, slow it down 80%, and it just can kind of help to smooth out motion a little bit and give you just a little different feel on the footage. So, but that way you can switch between 4K 30, 4K 24, 1080p, 120 frames a second, and photo mode, all just by switching the dial, and basically have all your settings set up, because whatever settings you set in this video mode with the little film strip will stay and remain that way regardless of what you do with the other settings, and whatever settings you have set on the photo mode will stay that way regardless of what you do on the other settings. So essentially you get 4 memory modes all on the dial, all being able to flip through them really quickly and have instant access to them basically. And right here, if you tap on this, when you've got all your settings set up, then you can record all those settings to one of those memory recall locations on the dial. Here you have your interval shooting function, which I use when I'm shooting time lapses. Really handy, really nice. Focus mode. For photos, I always use single shot autofocus with balanced emphasis on everything, but in video it's continuous. Occasionally I'll use autofocus continuous. If I'm shooting a lot of photos in quick succession, I'll just have it continue to focus. And for focus area, I'm almost always shooting in wide. The only time I'll switch to something like center or flexible spot is when I want to focus on something other than what the camera wants to focus on in the space. But a lot of times too, I'll just do a manual focus and set it up that way. For face and eye priority, I have face and eye priority on. I have human subject detection, and I want to see the face detection frame in the display. I don't have the animal eye AF on. I use for track sensitivity, I use responsive, and autofocus with shutter, where you can half press the shutter button. I have that turned on too. I don't have pre-IF turned on. A lot of these I just leave on the default settings. Exposure compensation, I do use exposure compensation when I'm shooting in HLG and stuff like that, or when I'm shooting on snow-covered fields and there's so much light coming into the camera from the snow that it throws the auto exposure off for the camera. Then I'll overexpose by 1.5 to 2 stops, depending on the conditions. I generally use ISO on auto, and that way the exposure compensation dial on the top of the camera works, and you can set it to overexpose or underexpose, however you want. Metering mode, I use multi, and face priority in multimeter mode, I have that turned on, because then it tends to expose better for the face. But if you're in a strong backlit situation, you're still going to want to kind of set that yourself and not have it auto ISO on that point. I generally never use the spot metering point, but I have it set to center. These are all these stock settings. I haven't messed with them much at all. White balance I have on auto, and then I'll set the white balance for the conditions that I'm shooting in. But if it's changing rapidly, I'll leave the white balance set on auto, because the camera does a pretty good job of capturing the close to the correct white balance. I have dynamic range optimizer or auto HDR. I keep that turned off. For creative style, I generally shoot in standard. Sometimes if I'm shooting in HLG, I'll shoot in neutral, because I follow the leaming LUTs set up for HLG and use leaming LUTs to get myself kind of to start off the color grade. And for picture profile, I have these set up like the leaming LUTs recommend to you to set up, except for picture profile 1, I have a kind of custom profile set up on that I shoot with most of the time. For focus magnifier, this is very handy when you want to shoot and manual focus and check your focus, especially if you're doing astrophotography or videography of something that you want to make sure you're getting really good sharp focus on it, products and stuff like that. Then you can use that to zoom in and check your focus. And I have that mapped to a custom button. I'll show you here in a little bit. I don't have a time limit on how long it magnifies for. I think occasionally I've gone and set that to like 5 seconds, so it'll bump back automatically. And then you can set how deep you want the initial focus to go. I do have manual focus assist on, and for the peaking setting, I have it on, high, and red, so that I can see really clearly when something is in or not in focus for both photo and video mode. Anti-flicker shoot, I do have that turned on. I don't really mess with any of this. For this exposure mode and movie mode, I use manual exposure, and I kind of set everything up the way I want it to set. With auto ISO, basically I can set the aperture and I can set the shutter speed, and then the ISO will compensate, which is the way I like to shoot. For video file formats, like I said earlier, I generally shoot everything in 4K in movie mode and on my memory 2. I can't show it to you here, but I always shoot in the highest bitrate possible to get the most amount of information that I can. So like this, when I'm shooting at 120, I shoot at 100 megabits. When I'm shooting at 24 in 4K, I just shoot as high as I possibly can to get the most amount of detail. I don't use S&Q settings, and the reason for that is this: you lose all the audio recording, and it comes out kind of ready for you in post. In other words, you can shoot at 120 frames and tell the camera you want to put it on a 24 frames per second timeline, so it'll calculate out those 124 frames in slow motion across a 24 frame timeline, but you lose audio. So if you want to do audio recording and do a lot of speed ramping or stuff like that, I shoot in 1080, 120, and then do everything in post that way. I don't do proxy recording. I don't really have to, but if you have trouble processing some of the files, you might have to do proxy recording. For auto focus drive speed in movie mode, I have fast and responsive for track sensitivity. I always have audio recording on, and audio recording level, I always start with this at 2 because it's kind of a starting point, and I use a DDD3 Pro, which comes in pretty hot, and so does the Rode Wireless Go, which is another mic I use. I have the audio level display on so that I can see where the audio levels are coming in at. Audio out timing, I have it on lip sync because I want the timing for when I'm listening in with headphones or when I'm live streaming or recording via HDMI. I want the timing to be the same so that the audio and the video are synced up. Otherwise, they'll be off, and you'll have to sync it in post. So I don't really mess with the onboard mic, so I don't mess with wind noise reduction. I don't mess with marker settings. Movie with shutter. I do have this turned on because that means that I can push the shutter button to start and stop recording. I don't use silent shooting that often, but if you're in photo mode and you want to have the camera be totally silent, you can turn silent shutter or silent shooting off or on there. I don't really mess with these. Steady shot, I have steady shot on, and steady shot settings, I have it set to auto adjust. Now, I do have a custom button mapped for when I'm using a manual lens, and I want to change the steady shot settings to match the focal length of the lens, because it does make a difference on how well the steady shot performs. It's important to match the steady shot focal distance or focal length with the lens focal length you're using if you're using all manual lens. For zoom, I have clear image zoom turned on because I do shoot with manual APS-C lenses like the Sony A7III and the Sony 50mm anamorphics, and I map that to a custom button that we'll show you here in a minute. Display button. This is where you can set what you want, how many things you want to cycle through on your monitor or on your EVF. I have them set to the same. I like to see all the info. I like to see the histogram so that I can expose to the right if I'm shooting HLG or something, or using the leaming LUTs and then I have the level, because I am terrible at getting the camera level when I'm shooting by hand. So I always have the level available so that I can see it and make sure I've got it correct. And I have the finder is set up the same way. For zebra settings, because I use the leaming LUTs, I have it mapped to a custom button where I can turn the zebras on, and then I have it set to custom 2, which is what the leaming LUTs recommends with the lower limit of 100 plus. So when I'm shooting HLG, HLG2, or HLG3, I can make sure I'm exposing properly for that. Grid line, I use the rule of thirds grid just because it's easy to quickly grab decent framing and set things up the way I want to set. Exposure set guide, I have that turned on. And live view display, I can't access it right now, but I do have that setting turned on because I want to see a preview, especially if I'm doing stuff in the dark or astrophotography stuff. I want to see a preview of what the photo is going to look somewhat like when I'm shooting in wild, harsh conditions, and so I set that on here. Now here's where we get to the custom keys. I have the custom keys set up for photo and video modes the same, and the easiest way to do that is, I think by default, it says follow custom 1, and that's the way I've got everything set up here, but you can set them up differently if you want. But like I said earlier, the more you do things the same, the faster and the better you'll get at it, so I set them up the same. But here's how I set mine up. For the control wheel, which is this wheel here, I have that set to ISO, so I can just quickly spin the wheel and go up or down in ISO if I want to change what the camera is trying to auto select for me. Custom button 1 on all my cameras I have set to white balance, so I can quickly grab the white balance and go from auto white balance to sunny, shade, cloudy, whatever. Or on the A7 III, you can also do the custom setting where you will use something like this, a gray card, do a shot, and the camera will find the correct white balance using that. I'll do that if I'm in a really bizarre type location. Custom button 2 is what I use for clear image zoom, because like the Sony 35mm lenses, take that off, or the anamorphic lenses, you don't have to go all the way APS-C mode. You can go as like 1.3, 1.4% and get it actually wider than the focal length. But then I also use it on some of my regular lenses. If I need just a little more reach out of them, you can clear image zoom up to 2 times, which is great without losing any quality when you're shooting in 4K. Then my custom button 3, I have set to where it's just really simple. Punch in, punch out, APS-C mode 1.5 times, which is nice if you're shooting with the APS-C lens on this that doesn't communicate that information. The camera doesn't auto switch. Custom button 4 I have set to monitor brightness, which basically means I can go from like manual to super bright, sunny when I'm out shooting in the sun and I need to be able to see. Multi-select center button, which is this here. It's the bumpy one up here. I have that set to my audio record levels. So if I'm flipping between different types of microphones, I can quickly hit it and then adjust the audio record button to where you want it to come in about -12 on average. So something like that is about where you want the audio to come in. That way, if you talk really loud, it doesn't quite peak, but also it's not too quiet, so you have to do a bunch of processing in post. And the reason I use that is because it's bumpy, so I can kind of remember like the jagged audio waveform. The center button, which is the center button on the dial here, focus magnifier. So when I'm shooting something in manual, especially when I'm shooting astrophotography, I want to zoom in on a star, make sure I'm nailing infinity focus. I can grab that and quickly punch in to see exactly where my focus is. My left button is drive mode, which is the default, so I can switch between single shot or like doing high speed shooting, different things like that for photo mode. The right button, of course, is the ISO to get in the ISO menu. The down button I have set to be able to adjust my steady shot focal length. So when I'm shooting with the Sony anamorphic lenses, I can set it to be 35 or 50 millimeters exactly. And believe it or not, it does make a difference on how well the steady shot performs when the camera knows the focal length of the lens that you've put on it. If that information isn't communicated to the camera by some chip in the lens, it really does make a big difference on how well it performs. And those buttons are all on the dial right here. For the AEL button, I have it to toggle my autofocus, manual focus between autofocus and manual focus. So if I can set up a shot and then hit the manual focus so that it won't change the focus on me at all, or you know, if I just feel like I want to get focus nailed on something that the camera isn't wanting to focus on properly. AF on button, I use that as the zebra display select. I know it's kind of backwards, but that's just the way I've used it, and so it's kind of locked into my memory that way now. Focus hold button, obviously that's focus hold. I really only have lens with the focus hold button on it, but it does, you know, my 85 and it works. Now if you want to change any of these, it's easy. You go into this menu, you tap on it, and then you can cycle through any of the 4 pages of stuff that you can assign to custom buttons, which is really nice for Sony cameras. And then we come to the function menu settings, which is what you can essentially... Now the function menu, there's a small button here that's function, and it'll pull up this menu here where you can change other things as well without having to deep dive into the function menu, which is really nice. You can change your white balance, you can change your ISO, you can change your exposure compensation, focus area, drive mode, picture profiles. Pretty much you can map a lot of different things to this here, including prioritizing your record media. And the place you set that up is right here. So you can use all the whole upper level of the menu and the lower level of the menu. And it's pretty much the same as going in here. You can select between a lot of different things, all the different options that they will allow you to choose to assign to your function menu. Dial setup, I have it so set up so the front dial is my shutter speed and the rear dial is my aperture. If you've come from another camera system where you want to switch that, you can do that. And then of course you can also reverse the rotation. The dial EV compensation, because this has a dedicated dial, I leave that off. But if you're using something else like an A6600 or something like that, you can assign it to one of those. But I never have. I always like it like that. Movie button, have it on always, so you can always just jump in and record video whenever, regardless of whatever mode you're in, by hitting the movie button. Even if you're in photo mode, you can hit the movie button on the back of the camera and it'll jump into video mode right away. Here, I don't mess with this much. The only thing I do is I keep airplane mode on all of the time because it saves you battery life, and if your phone and the camera connect automatically for some reason, you'll lose face detection when you're shooting in 4K, so I have that on all the time. Here you can select your monitor brightness, your volume settings for how loud stuff plays back to you in the headphones or on the microscopic little speakers they put in the camera. Display quality, that's the EVF display. Like if you want it to be at a higher quality, faster refresh rate, you can do that. Standard has been fine for me. And then how long do you want the camera to stay on when you're not using it before it powers off automatically. Auto power off temp, I always put this on high on all the cameras because otherwise they'll think they're overheating much sooner than they are. And this will give you a lot less overheating problems, but still protect the camera. I have touch operation off because I don't like bumping the screen accidentally and having it do something weird. But if you want to turn it on and like be able to track a subject through the frame, then this is where you would turn that on and the settings for that. HDMI settings, because I do use this for streaming sometimes, I always output 1080, 24, and then because I'm showing you this right now, I have the HDMI info on. Timecode output, you can have this output timecode if you want to, and if you want to be able to, like when I'm using the MixPre 3, have that and this sync up and start recording at the same time, this is where you would set that up, record control and control through HDMI. I don't use output. I don't output at 4K ever, really, so I just don't mess with that. For the USB connection, because I use different gimbals and almost all of them require PC remote as the setting on a USB connection for me to be able to trigger and start and stop recording with the gimbal buttons, then this is where you want to set that up. Make sure it's in PC remote, and then it works well. The other thing that's nice is if you have this tethered to a computer when you're shooting photos, you can have it automatically send the photos to the computer so that you can kind of preview them as you're going with Sony's software. Date and time, not really going to go through any of that. Record media settings. Here you can, this is where you can prioritize your record media. So I have it set generally where photos are prioritized to slot number 1 and video is always prioritized to slot number 2. However, occasionally I want to make sure if I'm doing some more high-end, high-stakes stuff, shooting for clients, then you can have it simultaneously record to both if you want, for photo and video, or both photo and video will go to both cards, so that way you have a backup of everything you shoot that day. But for the most part, when I'm filming for stuff on YouTube and stuff like this, I have it sorted so that photos are on one card and videos are on another. And of course, you can have it auto switch between media if one card gets full. So now this is the other thing that I do go in and take a little bit of time to set up in my menu here. And I'm going to show you how to add something real quick, but I have airplane mode set up there so I can quickly turn airplane mode on and off and be able to sync with my phone if I need to. I have format, so I can format the cards because I format the cards before every shoot. That way it's nice and clean file settings wise. I do have monitor brightness in here too, just in case. And then if you go over here, you can add an item. And the other thing that I always have in here is my interval shooting function, so that if I want to switch and have this do a time lapse, I can access it easily. So between all the custom buttons and between the My Menu settings, you basically have access to everything you need without having to go through and dig into the Sony menu system. Once you have your custom settings, your memory settings all set up, then you're really set to go. Now, if you want to know more about what kind of lenses and accessories, microphones and stuff like that I use on my A7 III that I've been using for the last 2 years that have withstood the test of time and Alaska, then I put together a playlist right here. You can click or tap right there, watch those. If you have questions, ask me in the comments below, or join me on the live stream Wednesday nights, 4 p.m. Alaska time, 8 p.m. Eastern. I'll see you again soon in the next video. Cheers.